Marshall Masters is a guy that is right in the forefront of the Planet X theory. He kind of has a Zecharia Sitchin view of the whole thing. That is that he believes that it's called Nibiru, that the Sumerians talked about it, that Zecharia Sitchin's translations of the Sumerian texts are more or less accurate. He differs from Zecharia Sitchin in that he thinks it's going to be here, depending on when you ask him, and just after 2012, 2013, somewhere in the near future. So that's kind of where he's at from it. With it, also he differs in Sitchin in that he thinks it is a binary star system, not a planet. So he thinks it's a brown or red dwarf star. So I'm just going to first talk about that issue with Sitchin. A lot of people believe in Nibiru or some version of that. It's really important that you know that the entire thing is, as far as Sitchin goes, we now know that the guy didn't even know the basics of Sumerian art, let alone the language. Of course, Michael Heiser in his excellent website, sitchiniswrong.com, goes through this much more meticulously than I'm about to here. But just a few things on it. The main thing is from this, what they call a cylinder seal, which is something that, like a Sumerian carving. And it's got a picture of what looks like, what Sitchin says is the sun and a bunch of planets around it. He essentially says that the Sumerians therefore knew that there were more planets than there actually are, one of which is Nibiru. Now, this thing is refuted pretty simply, and Heiser goes through it on his site. The Sumerians, never would draw the sun, like a thing in the middle there that he says is the sun, i.e. the solar system. The Sumerians, this would constitute the first time in history that the Sumerians drew the sun like that. And it's not as though the Sumerians were wishy-washy about how they depicted the sun. You got to remember, they worshipped the sun. The sun was Shamash. I mean, the sun appeared in almost every Sumerian relief, and it was depicted either one of two ways. One of which was like a circle with some squiggly lines in it, and very many examples in that. And another one is, especially in the later times, towards the Assyrian times, and a little before that, is the solar disk. But we could go through many different ways to show that solar disk was referring to Shamash, the sun god. We could go into detail, and Heiser goes into much more detail. I don't want to spend too much time on that because it's a radio show, and I'm not really going to be showing you pictures here. But I do want to mention a few things about Nibiru in terms of their texts. Now, nobody could have done this when Sitchin was writing his books in the 70s and 80s, but nowadays we can do a word search in the Sumerian for every instance of the word Nibiru. Every tablet that is known, like millions of these tablets, right? It took 90 years. But what they did was they took every word that's ever been mentioned in every tablet and they cataloged it. Okay? So, again, this is a massive project. The Chicago Assyrian Dictionary, CAD, the Oriental Institute, you can find this online. Okay, so there's maybe, out of all these texts, of all the possible mentions of this word Nibiru, I think it's something like 20 times is the thing mentioned. 20 times, okay? So we can look at every single instance that this word was used. Keep in mind, this was impossible at the time for the common man to do this unless they were at the university, where these cards were. So Sitchin knew he could get away with lying about what Nibiru was because he knew nobody would look it up or couldn't look it up. But nowadays we can look it up, and there is not a single text that has Nibiru as a planet beyond Pluto. There is not a single text in all those words that connects Nibiru with the Anunnaki. It never says, and the Anunnaki went to Nibiru, or Nibiru and there's just no association with the two. Complete and total lie on the part of Sitchin. The idea that Nibiru is cycling around the solar system every 3,600 years is a total fabrication. There's no other way around it. The guy just made it up. He knew you wouldn't be able to figure it out, so he made it up. In fact, the way that they talk of Nibiru, it's there every year. I mean, it totally destroys Sitchin's thing. What they believe Nibiru was around every year. And the reason I'm not being exactly direct in what they believed it was is because there is a little bit of debate about what the Sumerians believed Nibiru was. The reason is because they refer to it pretty much as three different things. But I don't want to confuse you because you're going to think, oh, well, the confusion is because it's a planet from the whatever. But the confusion has nothing to do with it possibly being, what Sitchin is saying. What I mean is that almost every instance they call it Jupiter. It's unambiguously Marduk. It's Jupiter. But on one occasion it calls it Mercury. And again, they knew what Mercury was. They knew what Jupiter was, and that's what they were calling Nibiru. But then there's an occasion where it calls it a star. And the way it speaks of it, it seems as if they're talking about a pole star, which, of course, if you know anything about precession, like our North Star, the reason it's the North Star is because of the way precession is right now, but it won't always be the North Star. It'll continually change. So Heiser takes the view that it is probably a pole star because of the way they speak of it. And like I said, it's there every year. But I don't want to go into too much detail because it's really just unnecessary. What you need to know is that it has nothing to do with 3,600 years, has nothing to do with the Anunnaki. It never speaks of it as like a planet that's beyond Pluto. I mean, at the very least, it's what they knew to be Jupiter and what they knew to be Mercury. So it's a complete fabrication on that stuff. And you can look at Heiser's paper on that for much more detailed information about what I just talked about. Okay, so the idea, of course, about Planet X, and this depends on who you're hearing it from, Marshall Masters says that by 2012, we're going to see 2 suns in the sky. So he thinks this is a binary star system. Now, one of the things that the guy always says is that NASA believes 80% of the universe is binary stars. And that's true. I mean, that's like the one true thing the guy says is, yeah, there are mostly binary star systems. Binary star systems are essentially 2 suns per solar system. Sometimes they have their own planets for each star and stuff like that, but there's lots of different variations. And yeah, we are unique if we're not, but not that unique. Like 20% don't have binary star systems. So it's not like we're really unique. But yeah, we are a little unique if we don't have a binary star. And NASA and other scientists, they still haven't discounted the possibility that we're part of a binary star system. But the difference between everybody else and Marshall Masters, or anybody else that kind of believes this way, is that when they speak of us possibly being a binary star system, they're speaking of it being anywhere from 25,000 to 95,000 AU, that's Earth to Sun distances, away from us. I mean, that's like, an amazingly far distance from us. And, of course, it would have to be that far distance for it to go unnoticed. And that brings me to my next point. And we'll talk about Nemesis more and what that means here in a second. My next point is, I talked a lot about this in the last episode, so I will only briefly touch on it, is lack of gravitational effects. If there was a supermassive or even just kind of massive object even approaching our solar system, we would know it. I have a little bit more information about what I was talking about last time. With amateur astronomers and everybody else, they know the planets are where they're supposed to be because of the consistency of our solar system. Everything's doing what it's supposed to be doing in our solar system. That's why astronomy programs are perfectly accurate. That's why when NASA sends a satellite to intercept a comet and all this other stuff that it does that seems like impossible, it all works because everything's doing what it's supposed to be doing, essentially. Planets are where they're supposed to be based on their mass and other, laws of planetary motion and stuff like that. Now, I talked a little bit about the history of that before, and I'll mention it briefly. But if a object comes in our solar system, it will mess that up. Even if it messed it up just a little bit, it would be immediately noticeable, not just to NASA. We don't have to wait on NASA for this. This would be something that every amateur astronomer in the field would tell you about the next day. If all of a sudden the astronomy programs are off, or, they're always looking for something called occultations that passes in front of an object. Like, you can study a star or something else that's really far away a lot better if you wait till a planet gets in front of it, and then as those moments when it starts to appear out from the backside of a planet, you can actually see stuff that you wouldn't normally have seen. So it's a really important a thing that amateur astronomers do. And none of that would, of course, work if the planets weren't where they're supposed to be when they're supposed to be. So the minute that they're not where they're supposed to be, everybody would know it. And the minute that an object comes even kind of close to us, that won't be that way. Mike Brown, the guy who was instrumental in demoting Pluto as a planet, said the following: "There are very good limits as to what you can hide at what distances in the solar system and not detect their gravity. You could put a Mars a few hundred AU, which is 10 times more distant than Neptune, 10 times bigger than our solar system, further out, and everything would be fine. That's the size of Mars. You could put Jupiter a few thousand AU, that's 1,000 times the distance of Neptune, and again, you're safe. There might even be things out there that we might find. He goes on to say, it's not impossible that the sun has a brown dwarf companion, but to be hidden from us, it would have to be much, much further out than the Kuiper belt, maybe like 100 times further. And at that distance, its effects on the Earth are pretty much zero. Now, a brown dwarf star in our near solar system, there have been models of this, I think I talked about it last time, of this thing coming in our solar system, what it would do to our planets and stuff like that. It's amazing. We wouldn't be saying stuff like, oh, you know, the sun is getting hotter. We would be saying, hey, our calendars no longer work and everything is going crazy. And that's before it even gets that close to us. So I just want to really, really reiterate that this thing would be extremely noticeable, even if you take all the theory. Anybody that has a Planet X theory has to do this thing first. They have to explain why nobody can see it, why you can't hear, smell, taste, touch, why it's invisible to every known possible thing. And so they come up with all kinds of theories, some of which we'll talk about in a minute. But the main thing they can't and don't have an answer for is why can't we feel it? Because the gravity is the thing that would do it, even if you gave them that it was somehow invisible. And of course, if this thing is as big as it's supposed to be, it would be occulting stars behind it, even if it was black and had no light, which is altogether impossible anyway. But especially if it's a brown or red dwarf, yeah, they're dim at certain distances, but when they're close, they're like a star. So yeah, if this thing is close, not only would it be bright, but I'll even give them, okay, let's just say it's not bright for some ridiculous reason. It would still be blocking out a whole bunch of stars if it was close. And so some people say it's coming from the south, you see. All the planets are going around the ecliptic, okay, which the ecliptic is a flat, if you just, the middle of the sun is the ecliptic, and all our planets are basically not exactly right on the ecliptic. They're actually on various, but they're basically more or less on the same plane, orbiting the sun, except for Pluto, which has a slightly irregular orbit. And so they say, no, it's not on the ecliptic. It's going, in a sense, in an up-down way, a perpendicular to the ecliptic. And so it's going to come at us from the South Pole, and we'll talk about the South Pole telescope. Even if it was doing that, it's not going to escape the gravity effects of the sun. I mean, that's like an elementary point of Newton's laws of gravity, that a sphere will act, gravitationally act in all its directions, not just on the ecliptic. The reason why things, orbit in the ecliptic ultimately is because they orbit to each other's center of their mass. It's such a common thing that even if you look at galaxies, you'll notice that they are all in disks. Even after, of course, all this time, they are orbiting in a disk-like shape. You don't see a big ball of a galaxy. They're in a disk. That's because that's how things do that. When you say, oh, well, this thing is coming in an up-down way, and that's why you can't see it, number one, it would still gravitationally mess with everything, and you'd still be able to see it. This is the same way that a lot of comets come in from that area. There's a cloud of comets around us. They call it Oort cloud. And then there's another band of comets called the Kuiper belt. The Kuiper belt's like about a light year past the sun or something like that. And it's basically a big asteroid belt on the outer rim of our solar system. It's orbiting the ecliptic. But then the Oort cloud is just basically like that, a big cloud around our solar system kind of thing. They will get kicked in, and when they get kicked in, they come at us in all kinds of weird orbits and stuff like that, or weird trajectories, I guess you could say. So it's not like, we don't know anything about those just because they're coming in from odd trajectories or whatnot. So not only is that wrong, the idea that it's coming from the south is just a way for them to say, oh, well, here's one reason you can't see it. But I think, as we talked about last time, that makes no sense either, because spherical geometry is such that if you're standing on, for example, the North Pole, you're able to see half of the night sky. It's not exactly perfect, but if you're standing other places on the Earth, if you have a flat terrain, you can, throughout the course of the entire night, you'll be able to see half of the night sky, more or less, give or take. So from the equator, over the course of a year, you're going to be able to see the entire south sky. But anywhere below the equator, of course, you're going to be able to see more and more and more. And there are lots of examples of this. I mean, it's well known. The Gemini telescopes, that's what they boast about, that they see the entire night sky collectively. There's two telescopes. One is like in Arizona or something, and one's in Chile. And because they're in both the north and south hemispheres, they can image the entire sky together collectively. And so you don't hide anything by putting it on the South Pole. The South Pole, of course, the South Pole telescope is the big thing. You know, the government's trying to hide it from you. But if the government's trying to hide it from you, they have a really funny way of showing it, because they built this massive, expensive telescope that is completely worthless for imaging dwarf stars or planets or stars or anything else. They built this great, extremely expensive telescope that doesn't even operate on infrared. It operates on, if it imaged a planet, it doesn't do planets. It doesn't do dwarf stars. We have dwarf star telescopes that are way unbelievably good, like WISE and IRAS, which we're talking about in a minute. But the South Pole conspiracy is ridiculous. That telescope operates on millimeter and sub-millimeter and microwave bands. These are huge bands you could measure on a ruler, and they are non-visible. The goal of the South Pole telescope is to image galaxies in the cosmic background radiation. It's to image things that are so distant. It's specifically tuned to do things that, by them being able to do those things, they make it impossible for them to be good at searching for Planet X. So it requires an ignorance of what is actually there in order to say it's all about Planet X at the South Pole telescope. It's definitely not about Planet X at the South Pole telescope. So dwarf stars in general. Let me back up and tell you again the story of Planet X. This is important. Masters leaves this completely out. No, he tells a story, but he forgets the most important part of the story. Just real briefly, the story of Planet X is this, that in the 1800s, after they started discovering these outer planets like Uranus and Neptune, they started to notice that, according to Kepler's laws of planetary motion, if those laws were accurate, then there was something going not quite right with their orbits. Mathematically, it wasn't able to be explained according to Kepler's laws of planetary motion. So what they called that is perturbations. They were being perturbed, that is, gravitationally perturbed. And the hypothesis was true with Neptune. This is actually how they found Neptune, where they said, okay, Uranus is not doing right. It is therefore mathematically probable that it's being perturbed by something, and that something should be right about here. And they said, would you go please look in this area of the sky, because I think something will be right there. And lo and behold, they found Neptune. So it really bolstered the case of this idea of, if you've got a perturbation, you can do the math, and the math on perturbations, as you can guess, is ridiculously difficult. But people do it. And so after that, though, they found Neptune, and it basically explained a lot of the things on Uranus. There were still some issues, but we later know that those issues were, let's say, operator error. The issue is this. So there were still some problems after they found Neptune, and they hypothesized that it's okay, it worked last time, let's do it again. It must be a massive planet out there, based on their calculations. Whatever was still perturbing them would have to be a massive planet. It would have to be like a Jupiter-sized planet, and that would, according to their calculations, sort of solve the problem, if there was such a planet. So the race was on to go find the planet. And then they found Pluto, and they were happy at first because they thought it validated the theory, but as time went on, they realized that Pluto was not a very big planet, and therefore could not account for the gravitational anomalies on Neptune and Uranus. So then Marshall Masters stops telling you the story. And no more story after that. From Marshall Masters, he'll essentially conclude and now nobody's yet found Planet X, but the search is still on. But in the real world, the search stopped in 1992. Because in 1992, Voyager 2 went past Neptune on its way out to the outer solar system. It saw Neptune and saw something interesting about it, that it was actually just a little bit smaller than they had previously thought. So it was actually, I think it was 0.05. I think I said 0.5 last time, a little bit smaller than that. So everybody in the scientific community realized if it was smaller, I don't want to say everybody in the scientific community, speaking absolutes there, as the data came in, they realized that this actually meant if it was smaller, then if you do the math, there wasn't a problem anymore. There was no need for this hypothesized supermassive object dubbed Planet X at that time. So after 1992, the scientific world stopped searching for Planet X in that regard. Okay, Planet X has since become named as like a placeholder for the next thing that we find or whatever, and that's a little bit different. But as far as explaining the gravitational anomalies that existed on Neptune and Uranus, nobody's looking for that anymore. But Marshall Masters is. And he doesn't mention the Voyager 2 thing, which is really disingenuous because that's like extremely common knowledge. And I'm certain that he knows about it. I mean, how could you not know about it if you're claiming to be so informed about this? Okay, so moving on to the Nemesis theory. You may have heard a lot about Nemesis, and I've often wanted to dig into Nemesis to see exactly what was going on with it. And I was surprised to see how kind of silly the idea was. I mean, essentially, the guy who proposed that Nemesis, that is to say, a potential star companion of our star, a binary star, which again is not a weird thing. Scientists are open to the possibility, but it would have to be extremely far out in order to make sense of why we... anyway, I'll get into that as I talk about this. The reason why it was proposed is because of a perceived cycle of mass extinctions in the geological record, which seem to occur more often at intervals of about 26 million years. So there was this belief that, according to the geological record, every 26 million years, not 1,000, we're not talking about the precession here. We're talking about a totally different periodicity of the 26 million year cycle that was believed to be an extinction event every 26 million years. First of all, that was even just one of many things that essentially would try to solve that problem. The idea was that, okay, so every 26 million years, maybe something orbits in a certain way in the Oort cloud. You remember that when I talked about that thing that was on the outside of our solar system? Maybe it's kicking in some comets from that Oort cloud every 26 million years, and that's why we're getting hit by that more often. Now, since then, and that would be just one of many reasons, right, if such a thing was true. And that was widely even admitted by the people that proposed this theory, the guy that proposed it, and later proponents of it. So, anyway, the evidence now is that such a 26 million year period does not exist, and the belief that it did exist was based on, I think, what they call statistical artifacts or something like that. I'll read what it says here. In 2001, Corin Baylor-Jones did an analysis of the crater, in 2011, Corin Baylor-Jones did an analysis of the craters on the surface of the Earth and reached the conclusion that the earlier findings of simple periodic patterns implying periodic comet showers dislodged by hypothetical Nemesis star to be statistical artifacts, and found that the crater record shows no evidence for Nemesis. However, there was a study a year before that one that says this, that's by Merlo and Bambach, found strong evidence in the fossil record confirming the extinction event periodicity originally claimed by Roppen and Sepkoski in 1984, but at a higher confidence level and over a time period nearly twice as long. Okay, so now the people in 2010, before the ones that said there was no periodicity, that was statistical artifacts, before that, the people said, okay, yeah, there is some kind of periodicity, but it's twice as long. So that would indicate twice as long orbit. One of the big things that people say about Nemesis, why it can't be true, like the scientists say, okay, like this is what the guy came under heat because he said it was a 95,000 AU, which is 1 light years away. Anything in an orbit of that far away from the sun is so close to the breakaway, what do they call it, the breakaway distance or something like that, of the sun's gravity. I mean, you're just so close. It's such a weak gravity at that point that you're just so close to being out of there. So they said nothing at that could have a regular orbit because it's such a weak gravitational field at that distance. The orbit would be so weak it could never be consistent, certainly not 3,600 years, as Sitchin said. But anything that far away, especially like Nibiru, would be so vulnerable to every sort of influence because of such a weak thing. It would be, to say that it was a regular orbit is, I'm getting a little off topic here. But what I want to say about this is that what most people have discounted Nemesis now is because of WISE. WISE is a second-generation infrared telescope that specifically searches for brown and red dwarf stars, and if there was anything in our solar system or close, it would have found it. Now, the jury's still out with WISE because it still needs a little bit of time to collect some data. They take multiple this thing literally takes pictures of the entire sky, like the entire known infrared sky. So there's a lot of data to go through. But what we do know is there's nothing big close. But they still don't rule out the possibility that there's a brown dwarf companion star, but it would be one of those really distant ones. I mean, there's nothing close, but maybe it's one of the distant ones. But they won't know for sure until the other data is compared. Essentially, they need to have two pieces to compare with to see which one's moving. But to make a long story short, there's nothing close. And if they are, WISE will find it. And WISE is the second generation of something, an infrared telescope, one of which is a really big problem for Marshall Masters' theory, IRAS, in 83. Let's talk about IRAS. I don't know how he never mentions this, but he actually just says that Planet X was spotted, and this is all over his website. It's in every one of his videos. He mentioned something about, oh yeah, IRAS, was reported in the Washington Times that they found Planet X and stuff like that. And that is such a plane on the ignorance of people about that. And we're going to talk about the crux of his theory here as we get into it, the solar stuff, because that's where it all falls apart for him. But this idea of IRAS taking a picture of Planet X and there being a big cover-up about it is so wrong. What happened is when IRAS was the first thing that NASA put out there that was going to do infrared. So it was going to see stuff that nobody had ever seen before. Nobody really knew what to expect. What's going to happen when you look at the sky in infrared? Nobody knew until the data came back from IRAS. When IRAS came back with the data and they looked at it, there was these big anomalies. Of course, everything is an anomaly at that point, right? You're looking at these things, and in a press conference, they asked these scientists, what could these anomalies be? And the guy said something, paraphrasing, like, I don't know. We don't know yet. It could be anything from a 10th planet to a distant galaxy. Something very, very similar to that. The Washington Post, however, ran with the 10th planet idea, forgot about the distant galaxy part of it, and said, scientists say 10th planet found, and here's the picture, or whatever. So Washington and other news agencies picked it up. So that's where it gives it validity. The Washington Post reported that they took a picture of it based on this guy's saying this at a press conference. I mean, he's tried to, as much as possible, say what had happened, but people won't listen to the guy that want this to be Planet X. But here's the issue. You can now go and check. Look, you can see the follow-up data. They took much better pictures of this area with much better equipment, much more detailed pictures of just that to figure out what the anomalies were. And they found out it was what they call an ultra-luminous infrared galaxy. These are galaxies. You've probably seen these pictures of like these things giving birth to stars. They're really amazingly beautiful pictures and stuff like that. If a galaxy is birthing a bunch of stars, it gives off this ridiculous amount of infrared. And so it's dubbed an ultra-luminous infrared galaxy. Of course, it's new because it's infrared, so it's one of these things that we now know exist as a result of looking at the sky in infrared. That's what it is. Everybody knows it. Nobody thinks that that's a planet. Nobody thinks it's a planet except for Marshall Masters, I should correct. To say that if somebody comes up and says, oh yeah, Washington Post reported on it and they took a picture of it, then you just tell them that they don't know what they're talking about. So, the crux of the matter with Masters is this. He basically says Planet X is really close now. I mean, 2 suns are going to appear in the sky next year. This thing is on its way. He thinks it's going to come between, I think, Mars and Jupiter. So we're talking inner solar system object. He says it's the size of Jupiter, which in itself is a blunder because no binary star is going to be under 15 Jupiter sizes. I mean, that's the smallest brown or red dwarf that we've ever heard of. There is a belief that they can get as low as 11 to 13 times the size of Jupiter, because it needs to be at least that size to be able to produce the things that happen in brown and red dwarf stars in terms of the internal fusion and stuff like that. So the idea that it's the size of Jupiter is ridiculous, but I'll just go ahead and whatever, give it to him. And so let's say he knows somehow that it's the size of Jupiter, whatever. Even if it's the size of Jupiter, we'll just go with that and say that he believes that this thing is going to come between the Earth and, Mars and Jupiter. If it's that close and it came at a regular interval, it's going to do more than, the asteroid belt and the planets are so stable, if it makes no sense if every 3,600 years an object came that close. The asteroid belt would not be stable. The asteroid belt is ridiculously stable. The planets are ridiculously stable and will continue to be so. They wouldn't be like this. We would be continually in flux if every 3,600 years something just barreled into our galaxy like that. We're not looking at the results of that. And you could just do models about that. But my point is not about that. My point is that the guy says that all this is happening, and the thing that he calls perturbations, how the only effects is, as far as Masters seems to suggest that we're going to get from this, is that a planet coming that close will mess with the sun somehow, a mechanism he fails to describe ever, which is unfortunate because it's like the crux of his everything that he says is about the sun. Somehow he's invented a mechanism in which this object coming this close does things to the sun, causes more coronal mass ejections, solar flares, solar heat, all these things. The sun goes crazy, and it's by virtue of the sun going crazy that it messes with the Earth and the other planets and causes earthquakes and causes all this stuff as a result of the sun doing it to us for the most part. Pole shifts and everything is because Planet X comes close to the sun, makes the sun do stuff to us. Are you with me? So he calls these perturbations. In this context, when you talk about perturbations, you talk about the gravitational effects that this Jupiter-sized object would have on the asteroid belt and the surrounding planets and everything else. But in light of any of that, which would absolutely crush his theory, he's got to come up with a new version of perturbations. His version is the idea that perturbations means the weather on Mars is getting different. And so essentially Mars, if you will, is being perturbed because the sun is getting hotter and it's making the polar ice caps melt. And I could get into a lot of the debates about whether that's actually happening on Mars or anywhere else or whatever, or I guess now the debate of whether it's happening, but what it's a result of, their local weather or, solar heat is a whole nother situation. But I don't want to go there because I don't really know a whole lot about it. I can debunk it a different way just as easily. The thing that really kills Marshall Masters' idea is solar cycle 24. We are in solar cycle 24 right now. Solar cycles are every 11 years. The sun basically goes up and down every 11 years, giving higher degrees of sunspots, coronal mass ejections, solar flares. And at the peak of a solar cycle, obviously it gives the highest number. And then, of course, it's got every 11 years, it's also got a low peak. So, and these things have been studied meticulously since at least 100 years. Most of these graphs go back to the 1880s. And you're thinking, how can we judge solar flares for 100 years? Surely we didn't have the ability to look at solar flares for 100 years. Well, the reason they're able to accurately know what this was doing for these hundreds of years was because you can easily see what's known as sunspots. Okay, it's just what it sounds like. That's spots on the sun. They appear in different places on the sun and different things like that. But if you look at a graph of, say, sunspots and coronal mass ejections and solar flares and solar heat all next to each other, it would be doing essentially the exact same thing. As sunspots go, so do coronal mass ejections. So do solar flares. So does solar heat. And it's so well known that just by counting the number of these stupid spots, you can actually tell all these other things too. So it's so widely agreed upon now that it's just included in these graphs. We have these going back to, as I said, the 1800s. Now, here's the crux of the matter. What happened was, in about 3 years ago, we started this solar cycle. And there were two groups of people that were making predictions about this solar cycle. To make a long story short, one was predicting that the sun had a long memory. Okay, that I don't know exactly what they mean by that, but when you read about this, that's what they talk about it. One group believed that the sun had a short-term memory. Okay, whatever. Now, the two different camps were predicting two different things for the solar cycles. Like NASA was a part of the long memory camp, and they were predicting that this solar cycle was going to be the worst one in 400 years. Okay? They were predicting a 400-year huge solar cycle, the biggest ever, and I guarantee you Planet Xers and everybody else have been reading and fueling their fires with these articles from NASA, and which is not exactly the first time that they've fueled a planet or a 2012 theories. I think that there's something going on with NASA and that, but that's a whole other issue. So NASA says it's going to be the worst one in 400 years. And that's 3 years ago. That's when Marshall Masters was writing his book, The Planet X Forecast. Everything that he says is completely dependent upon right now in 2012, 2013. In order for Marshall Masters to be even slightly right, in order for him not to be a complete and total quack, he needs the sun to be going crazy right now. Because if it's not, then he's completely wrong. So, is the sun going crazy right now? Not only is the sun not going crazy right now, what happened was none of this panned out. Basically, the crowd that said it was going to be a low number won the day. Once you're about 3 years into it, it's almost a given exactly what it's going to do. But it almost doesn't even matter what it does from here on out, because we are so low right now that if you look at a graph of this, where we are right now is unbelievably low. I mean, we're going to be lower in our highest point. I mean, even if you give it the benefit of the doubt where it's going to be kind of high this year, it's still going to be the lowest in 100 years. We are so far below the average. It's not ridiculously below the average. I don't want you to say, "Oh, well, but maybe it's causing the reverse." Well, no, it's just below average. It's not ridiculously below average or whatever, but it's below the average. And that you can see this in every graph, whether it's solar heat or coronal mass ejections or whatever. People are always saying, "Look at the solar flare; it's proof of this." There's always going to be solar flares, big ones, small ones, whatever. And if you're watching them consistently and you say, "Wow, that was a big one today," yeah, but if you were watching it in one of these, big solar cycles, you would be having a much more exciting time. Yeah, there's solar flares all the time. There's big ones, small ones, whatever. But there was a lot more and a lot different years. Do you know what I'm saying? I mean, we're looking at nothing of what was supposed to happen. Now the camps, NASA included, see a high solar maximum this year. Nobody does, and actually they learned a lot about, I've actually seen the presentations of them sort of admitting this. Okay, we learned a lot this time. We know now a little bit more how to predict this stuff and whatever. And they learned something really specific about this solar cycle. So they say that's important. And that will keep them from making the same mistake that they made. I'm not sure it was a mistake, but whatever. So, to make a long story short, the camps that think this is going to be a big solar cycle are gone. And the data is as crystal clear as you can get. This is, if Planet X is supposed to be messing with the sun, and the sun's supposed to be melting the caps and stuff like Marshall Masters always says, look at all the planets warming up. If the planets are warming up, if the planets are doing all this stuff because of the sun, then the question I have to ask Mr. Masters is, by what mechanism are they warming up? Because total solar irradiance is way down. Like the heat of the sun is way, way, way down. Like it was so much higher ridiculously much higher in the 2000s, 90s, 80s, 70s, 60s, the 50s. Solar irradiance was easily double what it is right now. Okay? And so in sunspots and everything else. And if there's more coronal mass ejections in the last 50 years by half than there is right now, and there's more solar flares, at least half more than there is right now, and the sun was that much hotter, what secret way is the sun now doing all this stuff that supposedly Planet X is causing? Is it a mystery new way in which the sun is causing all these things to happen? Because it's certainly not because it's getting hotter. It's certainly not because it's got more solar flares or sunspots or anything. So I'm open. Tell me exactly how this is happening. Okay, so there's something. The Kuiper Belt Cliff is something that Masters says exists, and it does exist. It basically is, we talked about the Oort cloud, of course, which is kind of a dome. And then there's the Kuiper Belt Cliff, which, well, the Kuiper Belt is kind of flat, like the asteroid belt, farther out than Pluto. And basically, there's a big kind of, what they call a cliff, a place where there isn't any rocks kind of in it. It's kind of like a gap where there aren't any object. People have proposed a number of reasons for that. Masters says, of course, it's because of Planet X, but there's lots of problems with that. First of all, people believe that it could be a massive object that's caused the Kuiper Belt Cliff, essentially, pushing stuff out of its way as it goes around the thing. And it could be a massive object, but when they say massive, they're talking about an object anywhere from 30 to 70 times the size of Earth. This is a small object, if it is one. Not the size of Jupiter, not anything else. That's not what we're looking at with the Kuiper Belt Cliff. So if he thinks it's a brown dwarf star, or his Jupiter-sized object, whatever that would be, certainly not a brown dwarf star, but whatever you would want to say, it's not that. But a bigger problem with that is the internal contradiction there that he has, because I thought this thing was supposed to come from the south. It's going to be on the perpendicular. It's not on the ecliptic. That's how we explain the fact that we can't see it. So you can't have it both ways. Either it's orbiting up and down, or it's causing the Kuiper Belt Cliff. You can't have such an obvious internal contradiction there. Now, he, of course, brings us all into biblical prophecy, even though he's, from what I can gather, extremely contemptuous of Christianity and the Bible and everything. But he uses it for his own purposes. And he says some very wrong things. Essentially, his premise is that the writers of various prophecies, of which the Bible being one, he names a number of others, which I may or may not talk about. I'll just say like what he calls the Colburn Bible, which we'll talk about in a minute. He says, they were all essentially trying to tell the world that this cyclical event comes every so often, and we need to be prepared for it. And he says that what is happening, which is described in the book of Revelation, for instance, is the same event that happened with the Noah's flood and with the 10 plagues of Pharaoh in Egypt. He said all three of those things are a result of Nibiru's various passages 3 times. Problems all over the place. Number one is that if the Bible was written for the purpose of, or at least this section of the Bible or whatever was written for the purpose of warning us about this cyclical event that supposedly happens, it really went the wrong way about it. Because what the Bible does is it goes out of its way to say what is happening in the book of Revelation is like no other time that has ever been, no, nor ever shall be. It is distinctly different. Let me give you a few examples. Everything in the sea dies. Everything in not just the salt water, but the fresh water dies. All vegetation is destroyed. Okay? This is like unprecedented, to say the least. I could go on to describe many more cataclysmic, unprecedented events. But in addition to the severity of what's being described in the book of Revelation, and comparing that to, say, the 10 plagues of Egypt, frogs and stuff like that, Egypt would have known a little bit more about this if, like, every piece of vegetation in the world perished and everything in the sea died. They'd be recording that a little bit different than a bunch of frogs showed up and then, the firstborn's sons died and stuff like that. It's just not the same thing. There's just no comparison. He goes through, his book trying to make these comparisons, but it's like completely trying to fit square pegs into round holes. It just doesn't work. In addition to the Bible's consistent reports that the day of the Lord, that is the eschatological judgment, not only is distinct, verses saying this is not going to be like anything else that your fathers have been through. You've got internal contradictions of it saying stuff like about Noah, never again will I judge the world like that. You've got places within the Bible itself that make you know that the day of the Lord is not going to be like any other time. But even more than that, and it's speaking of the day of the Lord and what's happening in the book of Revelation, it goes to some length to say that this is a specified thing that happens to a certain amount of people, to certain people, I should say. That is the wicked. The day of the Lord is just the destruction of the wicked, the day in which they get what they deserve. Okay? The day of the Lord, that's its function. Almost no matter what people's view on the rapture is or whatever, they essentially agree on this point, that what happens in the day of the Lord with God's wrath, somehow, some way, it is not for the righteous. And the reason it's not just one verse, God has not appointed us to wrath. It's like every mention of the day of the Lord, this is not going to be for you. Anyway, the reverse of that, the Planet X version, is that this thing undiscriminately comes into our solar system and destroys whoever is not in a bunker or whoever is not in an ark. And, as he calls these arks, these things where the elites will escape and stuff like that. So, and then his version of how everybody gets enlightened, because the guy's a New Ager, he channels, these beings and stuff, which is finally why I couldn't figure him out for a long time. I was like, is this guy like just a charlatan? Because, he's clearly saying things that are untrue, and I guess I thought he was just trying to make money, but then I realized at some point, listening to a radio interview, and he was talking about how he got all this information from the spirit world, and then it hit me. He's like, oh, this guy just is a complete believer that the entities that he's talking to have his best interest in mind. Even the occultists would laugh at such a notion, that one has such blind devotion to anything that they get told, and not realizing that these things are much smarter than us, have agendas. He would be in a very small group of people that were not wary about that kind of thing, or had no mechanism for testing them, and especially if they lie to him about scientific stuff, which clearly has happened. Nevertheless, that's sort of where he's coming from. Anyway, the idea he says we're going to get enlightened by is by virtue of us getting rid of our paradigm. Okay, ever heard that one before? Once you go through this great cataclysm, you'll realize that Christianity was a bunch of hooey, and you'll become an ancient astronaut theorist. That's what he says in his book, almost verbatim, except he doesn't call it an ancient astronaut theory. So once you become an ancient astronaut theorist and get rid of Christianity, according to him, that's going to cause an evolution. Well, it didn't work for Giorgio Tsoukalos. I don't think it's going to work for other people either, even if Planet X is going on at the same time. And of course, because that doesn't work, he has to do what I call throwing the kitchen sink at it in regard to these people that... I love it when a New Ager tries to tell you why you're going to get evolved, because that's always where the sticky part is. Well, it's going to be because the galactic alignment, which of course happened 3 million years ago and isn't going to happen for another 30 million years, so that's a lie. Demons lied to me on that one, says... well, they wouldn't say it, but David Wilcock, of course, promotes it. And others. So what I'm saying is they never say, or the photon belt or something, which of course is channeled information, which is totally bogus and obviously can't work. You can see my David Icke Debunked movie for more on debunking of the photon belt, or you can just Google it. Anyway, so he says, okay, so it's not just that you have to get rid of your Christianity and become an ancient astronaut theorist, and that's how you become evolved, although he says that. He says it's also because you go through this great cataclysm, and that changes you. And because the cataclysm is so great, and here is where he brings in Velikovsky and essentially the idea of evolutionary, you become evolved when cataclysms happen. Now, this is kind of comparing apples and oranges, even though it doesn't really sound like it. If you say that cataclysm will turn you into an enlightened being, and as evidence for that, you submit that evolution in the past or whatever was a result of catastrophic events happening and animals adapting to their environment after that. Yeah, those animals probably had to go, this is assuming that worldview or whatever, those animals, let's say a cataclysm happened and the food sources change, so they got to develop new skills or different beaks or whatever to get those food items, since there's a scarcer thing because of the cataclysm. Yeah, that would accelerate adaptation to the environment, but you're still a million miles away from that changes them into super beings with cool powers, and now they're much more evolved in their mind, and that's a different thing. Then, of course, he pulls the old Alice Bailey with the sun rays are going to do it. And that's sort of where he goes mostly, is the sun's going to get real cool, and it's going to change us into enlightened beings and stuff like that. So, and again, I'd have to say, if that's happening via Planet X, when is that going to happen again? It's certainly not anytime soon. Certainly not this solar cycle, we'll say. Anyways, so that's Marshall Masters Debunked there for you.